This book is about a particular kind of political discourse, and it's about the rhetorical strategies and the reception of this political discourse. What's particular about it is that it is the discourse of foreigners who come to the United States and embrace American politics and society as their new home, but they're also very critical of it. And because America is such a great destination for immigrants and has historically been defined as the destination of so many immigrants, we don't really expect them to be critical of this country. We sort of expect them to come here and be very grateful for having been allowed to live here, and we assume that since this was their choice, this is a place they will love and forever appreciate. And as a matter of fact, there are some interesting studies that show that in American politics, the reception of the immigrant is sort of a rite or ritual of rebirth of the nation. Through the enthusiasm of the foreigner, we rediscover our own enthusiasm for our country. So for all these reasons, a critical foreigner's perspective on American politics is rather unusual, or at least unexpected. And my book looks at what happens when immigrants or non-natives who live in the United States take a very critical perspective on American politics. I look at how they argue, what kind of strategy they use to present their point of view, and I look at how their ideas are received. And I focused on four cases, not more than that, because these to me were the most powerful. Hannah Arendt, Herbert Marcuse, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Edward Said. All four of them were major intellectuals, scholars, writers, and political commentators who came to the United States and lived here roughly in the second half of the 20th century. They were all very involved in politics. They had different political views. They cannot put in the same category. They don't belong to the same ideology by any means. But one thing they had in common was a combination of tremendous fame as scholars. They are all very highly regarded, and all of them had very successful careers as scholars in the United States. So a combination of that and a fairly vicious reception in American media whenever they voiced a negative political opinion. And to me that became very interesting, and I started investigating it and discovered that there really is a systematic set of strategies displayed across the discourse of all these four intellectuals, which I termed a stranger's persona. And by that I mean a way of looking at the world around you with its beliefs and customs, at the political system that governs this country, and try systematically to defamiliarize it, to not take it for granted, to not assume that the way things are is the best, and to propose changes that can be quite radical from your perspective as a stranger or as a foreigner. And I discovered that all four of them managed a very interesting blend of involvement and detachment. So on the one hand, they made it very clear that they care deeply about America and about American politics. Certainly they cared enough to get involved. But they also always insisted that, or recognized that they were not born here, that they had a different upbringing, that they had different expectations and different assumptions. And they did present themselves as detached, sometimes maybe even as far too detached. And then I traced interesting stylistic features in their writing. So for example, Hannah Arendt was notorious for her reserve and for her detachment in her political writings. She used strategies like irony, for example, which was certainly not unheard of, was very unusual in the context in which she employed it. So she used irony in her writings about a very famous trial in the 1960s in the United States of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the head of the SS during the Holocaust. She herself was a survivor of the Holocaust and was sent by the New Yorker as the reporter representing the journal to Jerusalem, where the trial was held. And her commentary was extremely ironic, and she tried to present Eichmann from his own perspective, which was misinterpreted in the United States as her essentially accepting Eichmann and accepting his views and almost siding with him, which was, of course, outrageous, especially coming from a Jewish woman. But her use of irony was actually designed to convey a very particular point of view, which is that Eichmann was just a regular human being who didn't set out to be evil, who in fact lacked the psychological depth for evil. And by that, she was trying to argue that totalitarianism of the sort that we saw during World War II through Nazi Germany can emerge anywhere, just from regular people who just do their jobs, because Eichmann claimed that he was simply doing his job. And that was that made a lot of people in the United States uncomfortable, because to think that just by doing your job you can actually do something horrible didn't sit very well with American readers. So the book, the reports later became a book, and it certainly triggered a huge controversy, in fact a scandal. And what I discovered was that a lot of that controversy was very much in response to a style of writing that also infused a particular perspective. It turned out the ideas that Arendt had there about the nature of totalitarianism and its connection to bureaucracy, for example, were very, very powerful and later revisited and far more widely embraced by a lot of American intellectuals. But when they came from her in the very beginning, they were dismissed on a large scale. And the same phenomenon happened with the other ones in different situations and with different cases. And it was very interesting to me to see that a lot of American commentators dismissed not only the views of these foreigners, but even their right to formulate a critical political opinion. And that was a kind of xenophobia far subtler than the regular xenophobic views that we encounter every day, that I was very interested in articulating, and part of the book is to document it. But I was also interested in arguing that a stranger's persona is a powerful way of keeping in check that kind of tendency to assume that it is only the native who knows what his or her country needs, and to dismiss the perspective of a foreigner simply based on the fact that they were not born here. For a foreigner, of course, for someone who came to a country after having lived somewhere else and after having experienced simply a different set of values, a different set of customs, it is relatively easy to systematically defamiliarize the world around them. It's easy to take a look at the way, for example, the educational system works and ask, well, why does it have to be done this way? Why is it such a good idea for children to spend 7 hours in school every day, for example? Simply because a foreigner has seen it done differently. But what I argue is that we can all engage in a kind of deliberate and systematic defamiliarization, just by simply refusing to take things for granted, just by simply refusing to become too attached to our way of doing things. And what I argue is that perhaps the greatest contribution these four foreign intellectuals made was to introduce in American politics points of view that had not been considered before. So, for example, one of them, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had been in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, who was very familiar with a very harsh political regime, came to the United States and quickly became very disenchanted with the fact that American politics was not more emphatically anti-communist, at least not as Solzhenitsyn would have wanted America to be. And one of the criticisms that he charged quite vehemently was that Americans are far too legalistic of a society. So he was very disappointed to see that the legal system in America is such that people sue each other very easily for anything that goes wrong. They rely on the law, and in his opinion, that was a way of giving up on morality, giving up on the ability to formulate your own personal moral and ethical judgment, and to solve your own difficulties just by having solid recourse to moral values, not always requiring a court, a legal system to decide who's wrong and who's right. And he believed that without that kind of solid moral fabric, a society cannot make important political decisions. In his view, America's decision to relax a little bit the anti-Soviet policy, which was happening in the 1970s during the détente years, as they were called. According to Solzhenitsyn, this was a terrible political mistake, very much based on the fact that the society no longer had moral judgment. And the connection he made between this deterioration, in his view, in moral judgment and a legal system that was ruling everybody's lives, I thought was very interesting. Now, I'm not necessarily embracing Solzhenitsyn's viewpoint or taking it for granted myself, but I think it is very interesting to ask ourselves how our institutions evolve. What are they replacing that we could do differently? And I think it is always very important for a community to solidify its links. And all four of these intellectuals were firm believers that American politics needs a stronger foundation at the level of the community, at the level of the people who need to be connected amongst themselves and trust one another and make solid decisions together. Perhaps the most surprising thing to me was to see the massive contrast between how well regarded these four intellectuals were as intellectuals. Nobody questioned Hannah Arendt's authority as a philosopher. She was a real star. Some people argue, although apparently this is debatable, that she was the first woman to have a major appointment in a philosophy department at a prestigious American university. So they were breaking new ground in so many ways. Herbert Marcuse was considered the mentor of the New Left movement. He was adored by American students protesting in California. His philosophy is very, very abstract, and yet they were reading his books, or at least claiming they were reading his books. And this, short, white-haired man wearing a bow tie and a black suit was one of their idols. But there is such an interesting contrast between the fame and the reputation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that they were vilified. And not just by the people who were sending, to some of them, death threats. In fact, interestingly enough, I believe every single one of these four received, at some point, serious death threats. And we don't mean isolated cases, I mean, a significant amount. They were vilified, and they were vilified not just by regular lunatics, but by very respectable people who seemed to be perfectly comfortable accepting the idea that in some regards they were brilliant, but in others they should be dismissed completely. And if you look carefully at what reason they had to dismiss them, it was really always simply the fact that they were non-natives. So then I became really interested in this myth of the native-born as someone who is destined for political office, or someone who is somehow more trustworthy than the ones who come from somewhere else. And as we probably all recall, we saw an interesting illustration of this paradox with debates surrounding President Obama's birthplace, and the question whether, if he was born on American territory or not, had anything to do with his ability to be a president. Of course, there are laws that say that you have to be born American in order to be an American president. But to me, it remained very interesting that there was this strong connection between being born a native on American land in order to be an authentic representative of America, and someone who can genuinely understand America. It was surprising to me because this is not something that you find in European politics, for example. And I don't believe it's something that even here is done necessarily in a kind of self-conscious way. I don't believe we're all aware of it. But the other very surprising thing that I found in this book was the combination of criticism in these foreigners and then a deep love of America. So in many ways, they admired America and they loved it far more than many American commentators who were not particularly critical of American politics. But there was an ideal America that they all constantly had in mind, and that they all constantly tried to remind all of their American readers of. So, for example, when Arendt landed in New York at the height of World War I, she immediately wrote to her mentor in Germany, the famous philosopher Karl Jaspers, and told him that she really believed that for once she had arrived somewhere where she would be always politically safe. And she talked about the American Republic as a great framework for freedom and autonomy. And she always had the principles of the American Republic as formulated by the founding fathers in her mind. And those were the criteria that she used when she made her very controversial political arguments, for example, about desegregation or things like that. Herbert Marcuse, I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but he seemed to have taken great joy in becoming an American president on the 4th of July. And even though he probably received more death threats than any of the other three, and was urged to return to Germany since he was such a critic of American capitalism, he refused to. And even toward the end of his life, when he was asked why he was still sticking around if he was so disappointed in American politics, he said, because America used to be great once and it will be great again, and I have no doubt of that. So this ritual of rediscovering ourselves through the enthusiasm of the foreigner is something that all four still made possible, while being very critical at the same time. And that combination of political optimism and faith in the foundations of American society, but also vigilance and constant criticism and a constantly fresh or refreshed perspective, to me is probably one of the healthiest way in which we can all behave in politics and society.